Thank you, everybody, for joining. Thank you for joining this U.S. Department of Energy NARUC Nuclear Energy Partnership webinar. I'm pleased to welcome everyone to this discussion on paving new trails for advanced fission with Oklo. Today's webinar will be recorded with the recording and slides posted on NARUC's website and emailed to attendees next week. A year ago, NARUC formally launched the 5-year nuclear energy partnership with support from the DOE Office of Nuclear Energy. Through this educational initiative, NARUC provides opportunities for state public service commissioners and commission staff to understand and discuss the barriers and possibilities related to the U.S. nuclear fleet, the nation's largest source of zero carbon power. We thank the DOE Office of Nuclear Energy for their support. I'd now like to welcome my good friend and co-moderator, Commissioner Kim Duffley with the North Carolina Utilities Commission, to kick us off and to introduce our stellar panelists today.
Thank you, Commissioner O'Donnell. I'm pleased to welcome Jacob DeWitte, CEO and co-founder of Oklo, and Jackie Kempfer Siebens, Director of Government Affairs at Oklo Incorporated. Following their presentations, we'll open the floor to audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to submit questions to the panelists at any time. And Jacob, you can go ahead and get started. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so I'll go ahead and get through the first few slides and then hand it off. Jackie will finish it off for us and then look forward to your guys' questions. So, we're excited to talk to you all about, what we're up to and kind of a picture on where we are and what's ahead. So that's kind of what we're going to set out to do today. Might go to the next slide, please. So as many of you may have heard, but what we're doing at Oklo is working on small next generation reactor systems, or as folks like to call them, advanced reactors. And in particular, we've been focused on a subset of those that are often referred to as microreactors, reactors that are quite small and offer some interesting paradigms for energy generation, especially as we think about how the grid and energy usage is evolving looking forward. We set about on this because we saw some really exciting opportunities, right? Trend lines in general for how markets were changing, how frankly, power and heat usage and integration at a local to behind the meter application were also evolving, as well as the opportunity to build and leverage some really exciting advancements that have occurred in technology development, specifically in fission technology development that frankly have been going on for the last couple decades, and many of which sort of were, I would say, somewhat under the radar compared to sort of what we think of and know today about today's nuclear plants. These technologies are really exciting because they offer some promising pathways for simplification, right? In other words, they have inherent characteristics that allow us to simplify the plant designs while maintaining robust and resilient performance. And that all helps us ultimately drive costs down while improving performance metrics as well. That also allows us to do fundamentally different things in terms of how we think about siting these plants and how we think about actually integrating them into sort of our grids or our factories or a number of various settings in which we envision these things being able to provide baseload, reliable, distributed or decentralized, dispatchable power, which is a pretty cool thing to think about. That's also clean. And included in that is the fact that we have very flexible siting characteristics. We don't need to use water at all in the plant outside of just normal potable use. So we don't need big reserves of water for cooling. So that opens up a lot of deployment scenarios, particularly in the West and international markets. And we've been at this for a while, actually. So we started the company 9 years ago, coming out of MIT, where actually my work and my PhD was on making big plants even bigger. But one of the things that started to stand out to me was sort of this interesting opportunity space in terms of bringing advanced reactors to market, especially what happens when you start small with them and what that opens up in terms of commercialization pathways and deployment pathways. So we started engaging with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission in 2016. We were the first of these advanced reactor companies to actually formally engage them in pre-application. That's another way of saying we basically started submitting reports, having technical meetings, conducting technical presentations to inform them and share with them information about our design, our technology, as well as our regulatory pathways that we were considering, and then using the feedback from those meetings from the NRC to inform our actual approaches that we implemented. We continued that through 2018 when we piloted an application that was leveraging new licensing frameworks that were in development That experience sort of set the stage and paved the way for us to develop a new application structure, as well as get feedback on how we should best approach that, given the fact that these plants look so different than what the NRC historically has licensed. And so that allowed us to tackle a lot of the, I would say, regulatory newness and get some good feedback that then we applied between 2019 and 2020 when we submitted our first application. So along the way there, we obtained a site use permit from the Department of Energy to site our first plant at the Idaho National Laboratory, so near Idaho Falls in Idaho. And we also were awarded fuel, a big consideration that I'll talk a little bit more about. So, these advanced reactors use what's called high assay low enriched uranium. That's uranium that's enriched above the 5% that today's reactors use, but less than the 20% threshold. We were really excited to be able to partner with Idaho National Laboratory and the Department of Energy to get access to material for our first core from actually recovered uranium, literally uranium that was recycled from a reactor upon which we derive much of our technical legacy. Talk a little bit more about that too. And so we submitted that application. We submitted an application on literally this day, 2 years ago, March 11th, 2020. I'll say, with people are probably tired of thinking about this, so I almost hate to bring it up, but that also happened to be the day the global pandemic was declared a pandemic. So it was a pretty wild time, but we're excited to get that application in. 3 months later, they accepted it for review. And then we spent basically 19 months working with the NRC on the review. Then in January of this year, the NRC denied that application as it stood, explaining that they wanted more information specifically around various aspects of the design and the methodologies we use to support their review, largely tied to the fact that this is new. We recognized that we had to do some things fundamentally in different manners based on interactions with the NRC, and they were very welcoming and receptive to that. But at the end of the day, the clock was ticking, and we needed to find some opportunities to basically close some familiarity and awareness and information gaps with the NRC. So effectively, that's what the denial opens the door for. Notably, of course, the NRC made it clear that they, basically expect us to resubmit the application after we can work through those items. We've got some pretty clear pathways about what that looks like. So we anticipate resubmitting the application later this year. And the other thing that's been nice is NRC has been pretty clear that they expect the review to build on the things we've already done. In other words, pick up more or less, close to where we left off and build on a lot of the progress that we did make, both in review, but also in pre-application with the NRC. We'll talk more about that, but if you want to go to the next slide, you can start talking a little bit more about what the Aurora is. So this is, the rendering of the plant that we'll build in Idaho. This isn't exact, it looks like Idaho, but it's actually not of Idaho, but anyway, it serves a purpose like that. The idea here that's been important for us is also changing the aesthetic paradigm. I personally, as a kid, grew up in New Mexico. I've always loved nuclear plants, but the aesthetic of them sometimes can feel distant. And sometimes the architecture maybe not as warm and fuzzy. And so that was something we set out to do that capitalizes on the inherent differences sort of these advanced reactor technologies and wraps it in an architectural package that's also functional. So this is what our first plant looks like. And now I can talk to you a little bit about what that looks like. So next slide, please. So the way the plant works is it's a small fast reactor. What that means is we use fast neutrons. In other words, neutrons that have high energies and are going quickly. How that works is we use metallic fuel in the system to basically, where we source our energy from. In other words, fission in the fuel creates heat that's then carried up to a heat exchanger and then transferred over ultimately to a power conversion system where we make electricity. It's similar in many regards to the thermal power cycles that reactors use today, just operates at a bit higher temperature, and it doesn't operate at pressure. In other words, the system itself is an unpressurized system that uses liquid metal coolants, which can operate at high temperatures without requiring pressurization and give us phenomenal heat transfer capabilities that allow us to make things smaller and simpler accordingly. One of the ways our engineers described this that I thought was really kind of a nice, simple way to sort of illustrate how this works is we take metals of various types and forms, put them in a specific configuration, and they make heat. And they'll make heat for 10 to 20 years without much intervention and without refueling. It offers a pretty reliable and resilient source of power that can be configured in pretty flexible manners for various use cases. The other thing that's nice is based on the physics of the fuel itself, of the fact that it's a fast reactor, and of the fact that we have this really highly capable heat transfer fluid, the liquid metals that we use, we can accomplish all natural heat removal in the system. That also allows us to simplify the plant and capitalize on the economic savings there as well. In other words, all the heat removal is accomplished by natural forces, and so we don't need a bunch of complex auxiliary or backup systems to manage that. And that's a major way in which we both increase reliability, increase availability of the plant, but also decrease costs. So next slide, please. And the cool thing about this, and I'll talk a little bit more about the fast neutron story here, is that this stuff has been done before. In other words, while this is really exciting technology and it's not really at large scale commercially around the world, these technologies have been in development for decades. In fact, just a few months ago, we celebrated the 70th anniversary of the first electrons, sort of usable electrons from a nuclear system that was powered by a small liquid metal cooled fast reactor out in Idaho in 1951. That reactor was called EBR-1. If you find yourselves in Idaho Falls, they have a cool little exhibit museum. Highly recommend you check it out. But the evolution of that technology actually manifests into this plant you see right here, which is called EBR-2, or the Experimental Breeder Reactor 2. The plant was initially designed to sort of carry forward fundamental concepts and engineering principles developed and advanced with EBR-1, while also demonstrating some advanced design features informed by those experiences. But it also did a lot more. In other words, it accomplished sort of the fundamental demonstrations of the aspects of this technology in a really promising way. It operated from 1964 to 1994. It demonstrated incredible characteristics operationally, lower dose rates than the existing plants at the time, higher capacity factors, and it was a test reactor than the operating fleet. Just attributes of the system, right? As well as these amazing inherent safety characteristics. So on April 3rd, 1986, these famous tests called the SHIRT tests, or shutdown heat removal tests, were performed, where they ran the reactor at full power. They locked the control rods out of the system, and then they shut down the pumps. And the reactor itself behaved just as expected with these inherent and passive safety characteristics. In other words, with these reactors, you can develop these natural phenomena that cause the reactor to self-stabilize, shut down, and self-cool without intervention. In other words, as it heats up, it shuts itself down, and then it's able to remove its heat just by natural forces. So pretty great combination for safety, and it demonstrated that at full scale. And that was in the morning, and then they went to lunch, came back, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but they came back in the afternoon. They ran an unprotected station blackout event effectively, quite similar, but far more challenging than what happened at Fukushima. And again, without issue. The reactor hummed along the rest of its fuel cycle just fine, making power and selling that power to the grid for 3 cents a kilowatt hour. It also demonstrated the ability to recycle its own fuel. So it recycled its own waste and made it into fuel that powered the system going, in its operation. It's a pretty neat combination of characteristics that's obviously pretty enviable, and that's why we decided we wanted to build on this system. So we get to build on that legacy and sort of bring it forward, modernize it, and simplify it for power generation. So one of the key characteristics of this are fast neutrons, which I talk about here in the next slide, that basically allow us to do some things a little bit differently than we do in today's reactors. I'll just quickly talk about this. Some folks know this, some folks, maybe this is a little new, but I'll just I love this analogy or talking about this stuff. So when you split atoms, you release 2 to 3 neutrons on average every time you do that. And those neutrons are born going quite fast, typically somewhere between 10 and 15,000 kilometers per second. So like really fast. Those are fast neutrons. Today's reactors, we slow them down. We bounce them off smaller atoms like hydrogen and water. And that has a lot of benefit, right? You need less fuel as a result. But one of the nice things about fast neutrons is when they're going fast, they unlock some different physics available to us in the fuel that allow us to operate, basically use the fuel much more efficiently. They become much more transparent, the byproducts of the fission process and various materials become more transparent to neutrons. So you have some really strong advantages and benefits from what's called the neutron economy. In other words, the number of neutrons you're producing versus the numbers lost parasitically in the system. And also on the physics side, it allows you to split some atoms that you can't split with slow energy neutrons. And that really opens the door for some really cool potential with regard to actually recycling waste. So those attributes, part of those, well, as I said, it allows you to have some flexibility in materials. That allows you to drive some cool things on design simplification, which I'll talk about here in the next slide. Basically, what we're able to do is take advantage of these fundamental characteristics on the fuel level, on the neutronics level, on the cooling aspects of the system, and basically have a small system that's quite simplified. In other words, we don't have complex cooling systems, external cooling loops that are exotic, very few valves, very limited piping lengths. Things operate on natural forces here that allow us to have an inherently intrinsically safe system with some pretty favorable cost savings characteristics that go with it, thanks to the simplification afforded by these things. Again, operating at basically ambient pressures means you don't need these really big, thick pressure vessels that carry quite a bit of cost to them. Operating at higher temperatures means we produce more electrical energy from the thermal energy we make, just by the laws of thermodynamics. And this also allows us to simplify sort of the ultimate heat removal in the system. So just the natural flow of air around the reactor vessel and other components accommodates all of the extra heat removal that we need to achieve for sort of our safety case. So that all together means that we can have a pretty streamlined, simplified system that opens the door for not only cost benefits, but operating benefits as well. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we see here that's really exciting is you kind of get a sense of what the plant integrated looks like is we can, have significantly fewer parts requiring regulatory oversight than sort of larger reactors, which makes sense by both sides, but also the physics allows us to have some disproportionate savings there. We have non-pressurized component, so that allows us to save on basically the supply chain, as well as open up a number of suppliers domestically, as well as from sort of allied countries that help us like basically diversify and navigate away from potential choke points. And that also allows us to, base that in the small size, allow us to do a lot of offsite fabrication and manufacturing, which opens the door for some favorable elements on the regulatory side, as well as, of course, the economical side. And what's kind of cool about this is sometimes people, I would say like at a broad level, the economics around small modular reactors is largely focused, I think, around the paradigm of light water reactor technologies and how those shrink down. One of the really exciting things about these advanced reactor technologies is you can think about the economics a little bit different from a ground up perspective. Especially when they're smaller, it becomes a lot easier to do effectively a bill of materials and chart of accounts literally from the ground up with high fidelity. And that allows you to track costs in the development cycle dynamically, as well as have high confidence in what those come out to be and develop contingency mitigating strategies for that. Not to mention overall, when you're smaller, you just need less total capital. And that affords us some really nice things in terms of our path to market and what we're working on. And then of course, because of these sort of natural attributes, the safety characteristics of the system, the fact that you don't need significant water sources for heat sinks gives you a lot of options for where you can build these plants. And we actually implemented some really neat things in our application structure in terms of siting and environmental reviews that the NRC has expanded upon in their generic environmental impact statements that they're implementing for advanced reactors, that include some pathways for microreactors that recognize the fact that these have pretty small environmental footprints. If you think about it from a technological perspective, the first plant we're building is a 1.5 megawatt system, and that technology can scale us up to 15 megawatts. It's electric power, right? At 1.5 megawatts, you're talking about a building that's less than 5,000 square feet. And even at 15 megawatts, we're talking about a building that's less than 15,000 square feet. Just not a lot of impact in terms of actual footprint. So it opens up a lot of flexibility with respect to that. And given that it's a nuclear system, we make heat, which dovetails into the next slide pretty well. That we can do things in addition to providing electricity. So we can make heat, we can make electricity, and we can do so flexibly. And what's nice about that is, sort of we see markets evolving where if you're providing power at sort of a district level, you can integrate with the pre-existing district heating systems. You can integrate with factories that may need process heat. A lot of the heat demand is pretty low temperature, and we can go relatively high temperature. But a lot of that heat demand is low temperature, and a lot of that's pretty cheap for us to take off the system, even just sort of recover it on the back end of the turbines without significant penalties on the electrical performance. So it's a pretty neat characteristic that you can have with these kinds of systems. And we also make it quite a bit easier for folks to be able to buy the heat and power we produce. From a business model perspective, one of the things we focused on early on was looking at what does it actually look like from the customer side for these really small reactors. And then based on our experiences and interactions, it looks a lot different than it does for big reactors. A lot of these customers aren't going to necessarily want to build, own, and operate these plants. They'd rather basically sign PPAs. And that's what we open the door to be able to do. So with that, I'll actually hand it off to Jackie, who can talk a little bit more about that, and then kind of take it from there about next steps and a couple other things we're working on.
Thanks, Jake. And we can go ahead and jump to the next slide to kick off that part of the conversation. So as Jake said, we're planning to serve as an independent power producer. We're going to offer end users the option to subscribe to Fission as a service, which has never really been offered before. This model reduces deployment hurdles by allowing end users to sign power purchase agreements and avoid the capital and operational burdens of owning and operating plants. So if you may have noticed through Jake's remarks and some of our earlier slides, a common theme that weaves through everything we're doing at Oklo is flexibility. Our ultimate mission is to build reactors that people want. And that means all different kinds of people living in all different types of communities. And the size of our reactors allows for a very small geographic and environmental footprint. You can site an Oklo reactor on an acre or less. I like to compare this to the footprint of my home, just outside of Washington, D.C. This opens up all kinds of possibilities for siting that would really be impossible for a traditional large light water reactor facility. Add to this the fact that our plants don't require access to water, and it really starts to open up even more opportunities. We can go on to the next slide. So when you look at the entire Oklo model, we are ultimately aiming for both flexibility and simplification. And we can go ahead and jump to the next slide too. So by owning and operating our facilities and operating PPAs, we are making advanced fission as a service a real option for communities and companies that have never really been able to consider carbon-free nuclear power as an option before. Because until now, it was really only possible for giant utilities and governments to pursue the sizable investments in both time and money required to license, build, operate, and ultimately decommission the facilities in operation today. At Oklo, we are removing all of those barriers and simply offering customers the carbon-free heat and electricity they are looking for at a competitive price. Now, this is certainly key here in the United States, where we're currently kind of trying to unpack and grapple with how we make this transition to a net zero economy. And this is happening, of course, at the federal level. We're watching this play out with the Biden administration and in Congress. This is happening at the state legislature level. It's also happening at the community level and at the company level. And so when we kind of review this landscape, we get really excited about the possibilities of the different ways that our reactors, whether it's this Aurora design or one of the scaled up versions we plan to deploy in the future, up to 15 megawatts to 50 megawatts. Our ultimate goal is to be able to offer a suite of technologies for communities, for companies, to actually be able to have nuclear on the table as an option for the first time without that huge burden and lift that has sort of traditionally accompanied any decision on including nuclear energy in an energy strategy. So we can go on to the next slide. So this theme of flexibility and simplification carries through to our licensing approach that Jake was speaking about earlier. So Oklo pioneered an application structure that ultimately builds from the regulations and stems back to an application structure that is really more streamlined and that focuses on what drives the safety case. So in March of 2020, Oklo submitted a combined license application of less than 1,000 pages, which, if you know anything about the regulatory space and what typical license applications look like, is a drastic reduction in weight, sheer weight of the application itself. Well, the Aurora produces far less power, has far less inventory, and has a much simpler design than any nuclear design the NRC has reviewed before, which reflects in the size of our application. And as a reference point, the Aurora has less inventory than one fuel bundle in a standard light water reactor plant operating today. Now, the process of licensing a simple and advanced design like the Aurora is new for both Oklo and the NRC. We understood both the opportunities and challenges presented by our novel approach, and that's why we piloted an application with the NRC in 2018, and we're the first company to engage in pre-application back in 2016. And so as Jake mentioned, and we'll probably discuss a bit more in Q&A, at the beginning of this year, the NRC denied our application without prejudice, meaning this was not due to any issues with the safety or the technology itself. Ultimately, they said they need more information in order to complete a full review. We've already had very positive conversations with the regulator and are very excited to resubmit our application later this year. And we'll not be starting from square one. So all of the hard work already completed carries over, and this will likely only impact our timeline a small amount. So getting back to our timeline, we still plan to have our first plant constructed and operating by 2025 on the site at Idaho National Laboratory. So we can go on to the next slide. So the long pole in the tent isn't the licensing. it's actually currently access to fuel. I've already seen some questions pop up in the Q&A on this. So our plants require high assay low enriched uranium, or HALEU, as do most of the other advanced reactor designs currently pursuing deployment. And currently, the United States does not have a domestic market for this fuel. Oklo has an agreement in place with Idaho National Lab for use of processed fuel from the old EBR-2 test reactor. And this will provide enough fuel to power likely our first 2 cores, maybe more. But beyond this, there is still a pretty big question mark hovering over the entire industry on what the supply chain for advanced reactors will look like in the next 10 to 20 years. And that is just one of the many reasons Oklo is pursuing commercialization of a pilot scale and ultimately a commercial scale recycling facility. Now, this is a technology based on engineering scale demonstration accomplished over decades at Idaho National Laboratory and Argonne National Laboratory. And we've actually already engaged in pre-application activities with the NRC and are working towards submitting our license application for a facility in 2025. We can go on to the next slide. So the U.S. has produced, to give you kind of like a bit more context on why Oklo is actually pursuing recycling technology, the commercialization of recycling technology. The U.S. has produced about 85,000 tons of used nuclear fuel since the 1950s and continues to produce it at about 2,000 tons each year. But this commonly referred to waste isn't waste at all unless we waste it, because it actually contains more than 90% of its original energy content. So Oklo plans to use electro refining to separate uranium and the transuranic elements from the shorter lived waste, and then fabricate this material into metal fuel for fast reactors. And there's actually enough energy and used fuel to power the US for over 150 years. This is particularly relevant as we are watching current events unfold in Ukraine and the impacts being felt around the world. Currently, countries across Europe are now revisiting their energy strategies in search of near-term alternatives that will allow them to sever ties with Russia. In the United States, energy independence has been a long-time priority for both economic and political reasons. American energy independence has traditionally been framed as increasing our production of fossil fuels. As countries around the world are considering the consequences of more severe sanctions on Russian energy, many are simultaneously pursuing a historical transition away from fossil fuels, a transition that requires a range of technologies, including existing nuclear power and advanced fission. So while Western Europe is seeking immediate measures to fill a potential gap left by an absence of Russian fuel, it's really important to also adjust long-term energy strategies to ensure future geopolitical upheavals can't impact energy supply. And so actually completing our full supply chain and closing the fuel cycle here by using technologies like we're talking about here really does guard against those shocks that we see from upheavals like we're experiencing now. And another benefit is that our cores, once you place a Aurora reactor or an Oklo reactor and start it up, it's fueled for 10 to 20 years. So you're not looking at that sort of same cycle of having to refuel a reactor that you currently see with the existing fleet. So we can jump on over to, or actually we're good, stay here for a minute, sorry. So this is an example, just sort of a graphic that sort of shows what we're using when we're talking about recycling current spent fuel, right? The spent fuel that's sitting at midterm storage sites from our operating plants across the country today. As I said, so much of this material is just still sitting there as energy that's, yes, being wasted, right? So that's the most appropriate way to use the term waste, if we're ever going to refer to spent fuel as waste, is that we're wasting the energy that is left sitting there that can actually be utilized in reactors like Oklo's. And we're also planning to recycle our own fuel. So while we can certainly help sort of address the spent fuel and nuclear waste issue in our country today with what already exists, the fact that we're going to actually be able to recycle our own fuel actually drives down the cost of our fuel dramatically. So we can go ahead and jump to the next slide and we'll get more into that a little bit. So fuel reprocessing or recycling has a history of being very big and very expensive. But the combination of fast reactors with electro refining can truly generate a paradigm shift. Key to this is the fact that fast reactors are able to accept a messier fuel. Fast reactors use fast neutrons and can access the remaining energy content. In other words, they can fission the entire actinide vector, or nearly all the relevant material in used fuel. This means that the transuranic waste and spent nuclear fuel can be kept together for the recycling process. This requires a simpler process overall because there is no need to separate out specific components like plutonium, which also has significant non-proliferation benefits. The simplification of the process also significantly reduces cost. Argonne National Lab and Landmark Foundation recently put together a study and presented economic models for both a 100 megaton facility and a 400 facility. And what they found was that Oklo recycling can produce fuel potentially more cheaply than fresh HALEU, which today's market rate for HALEU would be approximately $8,000 a kilogram. So we can jump to the next slide. So this is sort of how this breaks down. So if we were at the 100 facility, you're looking at producing approximately 2 to 3 Oklo cores per year from recycled light water reactor fuel, used fuel today. And essentially what you're looking at is $5,000 to $10,000 per kilogram for that HALEU. So keep in mind that number we gave earlier, and it's at the bottom of the screen, right? So the market rate now is approximately around 8,000. So we're potentially already looking at either right on or below what the market rate for HALEU is today. But if we were to actually charge for the recycling of that fuel, which we don't include in that first number, that's us just taking the spent fuel for free. Just give it to us, we're going to recycle it. But if we started charging for that recycling, the cost reduces even more. And so you can sort of see the same thing play out. But on a larger scale with the 400 facility, we could produce approximately 6 to 10 Oklo cores per year. And then your costs drop to 1.9 thousand to 4,000 per kilogram, or yes, negative if you actually charge for recycling. So the benefits cost-wise are enormous when you look at what the actual potential is here if we're able to scale a facility like this. And then if you jump to the next slide, we actually look at what the cost looks like if we're recycling Oklo fuel, if we're recycling our own fuel. So if we could just jump to that next one. Yeah, so same thing for both the smaller facility and the larger facility. If we're recycling our own fuel, we could produce fuel for about $600 per kilogram, which drops astronomically lower than what we just saw. And then of course, at the scaled up facility, we're looking at $210 per kilogram. So the benefits here are enormous. And especially when you're looking at fuel costs rising everywhere right now, questions around, what does it look like for the US to simultaneously pursue energy independence and a carbon-free society? This is an option that should 100% be on the table that we should be pursuing. So if we can jump to that next slide. And so what's really exciting is that there is a lot of support and a lot of energy around this right now. And so just recently, we were able to announce, just really only over the past couple of weeks, 3 really exciting new partnerships that we've entered into and awards that we've received in partnership with the Department of Energy and the National Labs. So I just want to touch on a couple of these quickly. So the first project is funded by the Department of Energy's Technology Commercialization Fund, and it's focused on the electrochemical separation process in which uranium and other transuranic elements are separated from the used fuel. That's the electro refining. And this work will focus on commercializing advanced sensors that are being developed at Argonne, which are used to provide real-time measurements of the salt composition and salt level in the electro refining cell. And so this is really essentially helping to account for material. To count the material helps a lot with safeguards, and it's really going to help enable electrorefining to scale efficiently for commercial application. And then the next projects we have is funded by ARPA-E under their Open 2021 program. And it's focused on demonstrating, again, we're kind of getting into that material accountancy, material safeguards and security of the electrorefining facility using advanced methods for materials accountability. So the project will develop modern multimodal sensors capable of producing high fidelity mass accounting measurements to ensure the fuel is accounted for at every single step of the recycling process. So there's a lot of excitement around this from really the entire nuclear ecosystem, and especially the sort of nuclear security, non-proliferation safeguards communities. And then finally, just yesterday, it was announced that we are entering into a project with the Onwards program. So this is funded by the Department of Energy's the ARPA-E. And Onward stands for Optimizing Nuclear Waste and Advanced Reactor Disposal Systems. And this project is focused on industrializing the electro-refining process that we've already described to you, as well as the other three main unit processes that are required to support it. So these processes include separating the metal fuel from salt, separating fission product waste from the salt, and recycling the salt for reuse. Advanced automation techniques and sensor technologies will be deployed to optimize each of these unit processes, and the entire end-to-end integrated process will be demonstrated. So this demonstration will provide the technical basis for a commercial scale facility. And in addition, the project includes a partnership with Deep Isolation, for many of you that are probably familiar with this company, a waste disposal company, to help evaluate a solution for the ultimate disposal of the final waste form. So really encompassing the entire back end of the fuel cycle. So we're really, really excited to be at a place where we're seeing just a lot of excitement around this, a lot of support. And, you know, this year is really just, we think really setting us up, not only as a company, but as an industry, to hopefully, you know, really move forward to the end of this decade and into the next, with a growing industry, with products like ours that are really reactors that people want, that communities want, that companies want, and that are accessible. Folks can actually access and choose nuclear energy, to include nuclear energy in their energy strategies without sort of the traditional burdensome capital and investment that accompanies that. We're really excited to lead on this. Thanks. Kim?
Okay, this was great. Jacob, do you have anything else to say before we head to question and answer?
No, excited about the questions. Happy to jump in.
Super. Okay, we have one from Commissioner Scarmetta. Are any of the SMRs currently manufactured and in use in any capacity for analysis? And then he asks a follow-up question. What is the estimated cost per 100 megawatt capacity?
Yeah, great questions. Currently, no, there are no SMRs from the U.S. that are manufactured or in use sort of anywhere right now. There is international experience, and we have built small reactors in the U.S. before and operated them, like the one we talked about, EBR2. So there's some experience on some of those items, but a lot of those were test facilities. So, you know, the analogs are they're very relevant for fundamental characteristics, but from construction and other aspects, you know, the commercial plants are generally going to be quite a bit simpler to build, because you don't need all the research and development capacity and infrastructure at these things. So I think that's one of the things that, you know, we're excited about seeing propel forward. And there's been great work by other designers in the space. NuScale's done a lot of work developing out different parts of their components and building them. You know, we've done some of that in the past. We've got some plans to be resuming that here this year and accelerating that. So those are all pretty useful data points on this. But I think one of the exciting things is the fact that these components are generally smaller, and you can implement sort of, I would say, more diverse sort of sourcing approaches on them. That's very useful in terms of having a robust but also economical supply chain.
Absolutely. It's all very fascinating. I'm going to another question from Kevin Cross. Isn't Russia the historical source of HALEU? How has the discussion changed about this in the last few weeks? And then he also asks, please discuss potential ramp rates and the capability for load following.
Yeah, I can start real quick on the ramp rates, and Jack, if you want to hit the HALEU one, just on that. Yeah, so one of the nice things is nuclear systems, by and large, can, you know, have pretty accommodating ramp rates. It's just a question of, does it make sense to do it from an economics perspective or from an operating perspective? Some of these advanced reactors have some fundamentally different characteristics that make their ramping sort of capabilities and flexibility more attractive. But in many ways, we see the best ways to do that are through integrating through other means of energy storage, either through like thermal energy storage, or if there's electrical energy storage on capacity. But usually it's a little more accommodating through those means than necessarily changing reactor power. That said, one of the cool things about like our design, and even the EBR2 sort of predecessor, if you will, was they drove those things pretty significantly from the turbine and demonstrated some very elegant characteristics in terms of following load, just sort of doing turbine controls and not having to touch anything in the plant. Because as the plant heats up, it drops in power, and as it cools down, it goes up in power. So just changing the energy draw of the system will actually self-respond, and it's actually quite graceful in how it does that. So there's some pretty attractive mechanisms by which we can see that working out, especially in different applications where you're sort of driving a microgrid, for example.
Great. And Jackie, did you want to touch on the HALEU question?
Sure, yeah. So I think certainly this has really kind of churned up a conversation that's already been top of mind. So back in 2020, in the Energy Policy Act of 2020, the Advanced Nuclear Fuel Availability Program was authorized. And just recently, like I want to say a few weeks ago, the RFI process was closed out for that program on wanting to sort of have, you know, information on how folks think this should sort of move forward. And so in theory, this program is going to help lift a commercial industry or commercial supply chain for HALEU here in the United States. There's been a lot of debate about what that should look like, and also debate about whether or not we should also be looking at downblending existing material that is currently, you know, sort of owned by NNSA. I think that in the moment that we're in now, the reality is, and a lot of the companies that are sort of out front, along with Oklo, you know, have publicly talked about the fact that they have considered looking to 10x in Russia for fuel for at least their first reactors. Because ultimately, from what we understand, even if we start to see DOE actually move fast on the fuel availability program, estimates are that we really wouldn't see available fuel from that effort until closer to 2027 or 2028. And so folks have really had to look to what are our options. And so I think that we find ourselves in a moment that is honestly a reminder of what we already knew, which is that, you know, we are vulnerable right now to sort of shocks to the geopolitical system that we're experiencing. And we never should be in a situation where we're dependent on an international provider like Russia for critical fuel like this. Not to mention the fact that, you know, a lot of folks understand the importance of the United States continuing to lead in the global, you know, civilian nuclear marketplace, not only for economic reasons and for, you know, sort of clean energy and climate reasons, but also for the fact that whoever leads in that space is also really leading on the non-proliferation and security norms that we've relied on so long to really keep us in a place where we can continue to do this safely and securely. And so that's a long-winded way of answering the question to say that I think it's certainly impacting the sort of political calculus on how much we want to invest in this and how fast we want to invest in this as a country. And so as we sort of emerge, hopefully from one budget and appropriation cycle and start to look at another, I'm hopeful actually that this really could potentially, you know, serve as an impetus to move. It saddens me greatly that such a tragic circumstance is what's actually sort of getting things in gear. Because, you know, while we're talking about sort of the global impacts of this, the real human consequences that are happening on the ground are horrible. But I do think we're starting to see an impact on that in the discussions here in the U.S. Yes.
And talking about safety, could you guys talk a little bit about, and we're talking about Russia and we've seen the actions with Chernobyl. Can you talk about your safety protocols with respect to the Oklo facility?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the great things about these technologies is you can build the physics of safety naturally into the system. In other words, you put physics sort of on your side in terms of keeping the system safe. So, you know, you just rely on the natural forces and natural physics and phenomena of the system to keep it controlled and cooled. In other words, you know, as the system, if it were to heat up, for example, if there were disturbance in its cooling, the fuel expands, and that expansion actually causes the fuel atoms to move further apart and more neutrons to then leak out of the system. A phenomena that, you know, we've got a lot of data on from other reactors of very similar types. So we know this stuff works. It's not just on paper. And that causes the reactor to, you know, shut itself down or drop in power. And then on top of that, all the heat transfer is accommodated by just the natural circulation. In other words, hot air, hot liquids rise So that effect is what allows us to drive all the extra heat and all the cooling in the system so we can remove it all without needing external power or pumps to run or sources of water or coolant inventory and makeup systems. All of the other things that we have that work, by the way, very well in today's plants and have great safety characteristics. But removing them obviously enhances the safety profile, but also actually helps a lot on the economics because you simplify the system and you make the safety just that much more robust thanks to the laws of physics, frankly.
Great. And then another question that I have received, could an Oklo reactor function in a microgrid that's could fully island from the distribution grid during an outage?
Yes, it's one of the really exciting things about what the markets look like here. In other words, we've been working with potential customers who are very interested in this capability, and it's a I'll say relatively straightforward thing to do, and a pretty significant enabler when you think about what that affords for resilience, for continued operations, for energy security. It's a pretty neat thing. And I'll just add one thing too, is like when you load up a system, you've got 10 to 20 years, depending on customer preference, of fuel in it. So you're not subject to fuel disturbances either. It's not like we're connected to a pipeline or something that could change. Once it's in there, you're good for a decade or more. So it's got some pretty neat capabilities that way.
Great. And another question that came in, how does electro refining work in practice? Does that require diverting electricity toward fuel recycling? And how does that affect the cost of a PPA?
Yeah, I'll hit a quick one and Jackie can talk a little on cost if that's cool. Basically, it's an electrochemical process, so you have a separate plant. This doesn't happen at the reactors. When the reactors, think of our fuel fabrication facility. There you also have the electro refining and recycling capability. So you bring the fuel in, and you use electrochemistry to drive this process. It's frankly not that energy intensive, but it uses some power. And I think one thing we're really excited about is building our own reactors to power that facility. Talk about a truly deeply decarbonized and not zero carbon footprint perspective. But also that allows us to make fuel cheaper, like Jackie was saying. Jackie, maybe you want to elaborate?
Yeah, so kind of getting back to what we discussed during the presentation, when we really kind of outlined when we're either recycling, especially at a larger scale facility, whether we're recycling existing light water reactor spent fuel, or especially if we're recycling our own, that reduces cost of the fuel, which ultimately is going to drastically reduce the cost of a PPA agreement, right? So that's kind of what we're looking at there. And then kind of something that Jake touched on too, I just want to highlight, is when we're talking about whether we're recycling existing spent fuel or our own fuel, and we're talking about the fact that that can sort of further reduce our carbon footprint, that's because we're removing the mining process. We're removing the entire rest of the typical front end of the fuel cycle, because we're closing that up. And so, it not only does it drive down costs for our customers, but it also continues to drastically reduce our carbon footprint even more than it already is.
Great. And I think this next question is from Commissioner O'Donnell. It is, what is the all-in permanent O&M and support staffing at a plant like Aurora?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it varies a little bit on the site and where you put this. In some facilities where you're building these things, you're building them co-located with industrial facilities. So there's some sort of shared overhead staffing. But it's a pretty low footprint, right? In other words, we basically build it so you have 2 folks on site, basically at all times, right? Kind of there are site monitors there for, being on site to help with anything that comes up maintenance wise, and being eyes and kind of boots on the ground, if you will, or I should say, feet on the ground. They might have to wear work boots, but anyway, it's a pretty kind of light touch job to sort of be present on that stuff. And what's kind of nice is that scales a little bit too, with respect to, even some of the bigger plants. It's still pretty reduced footprint. Again, the goal we really have here is ultimately about economic power production. While the other attributes we have in terms of resilience and reliability are great, the goal is economics, right? If we can be cheaper than alternatives, you're in a good spot. That obviously saves ratepayers money. That allows for more economic development. And I think everyone right now is excited about ways to save costs and energy. And that's one of the great things that I think nuclear fundamentally has the ability to do. I think one of the motivating factors for why we started this company is when you look at the raw cost potential of nuclear, it's unparalleled. It requires the least materials per megawatt hour of energy it produces over its life cycle, compared to everything else by far. So clearly, right, the disconnects have been in how we implement the technology. And that's where when you combine the right aspects of the system, of the engineering, of the physics, of safety, you can come up with some really favorable numbers. And all that's rooted in our awesome energy density advantage. You know, a golf ball of uranium metal could power an entire lifetime. That's a pretty cool thing, right? So I think that's what we see is what ultimately opens the door. And part of that is the operating costs. So, you know, we obviously, we have to be mindful of that, but that's part of why we design these systems with pretty simplified footprints and operating characteristics, very few moving parts. One of the things I always get a kick out of is we build a team that draws on a lot of disciplines, which is one of the really cool things going on, right? Like right now, people understand the urgency of working on climate, and now it's just being added another sense of urgency with respect to what it means for geopolitical purposes. So we see great, capable engineers coming from amazing other tech companies. For example, we're in the Bay Area, so that's part of it, who come in and, you know, for example, you get electrical or mechanical engineers who come from, for example, aerospace. They come and see how simple the systems are, and they're like, oh man, this is so much easier to maintain and design against and operate. And the same thing is true for folks coming in, not just from nuclear, but also from like natural gas. So that actually pays a lot of dividends in terms of the long-term operating costs and the stability of those costs.
One thing I just want to jump in on sort of just the simplification like theme and sort of the reduction in cost and why we care so much about that. So we're super focused on and excited to deploy domestically, but we've had a ton of interest internationally as well. And I just want to talk for a minute about why this model, I think, is so important for actually successfully deploying advanced fission internationally, particularly in areas of severe energy poverty. And so when we talk about energy poverty, I think a lot of people tend to think about it as, oh, like this is communities that don't have access to being able to keep the lights on at night. So they, you know, they really just need things that are going to allow them to run the dishwasher and have sort of reliable power on a day-to-day basis to do things. But at the end of the day, what you're really talking about with energy poverty is whole system, right? It's looking at countries that are trying to build out industry and to build their entire economies while simultaneously actually reducing their carbon emissions. And nuclear can play an extremely big role in that. But oftentimes the barrier that countries are seeing historically to building nuclear is very disincentivizing to pursue that route. And so what we're offering is very, very interesting to a lot of countries that are sort of trying to battle energy poverty while simultaneously actually caring about their carbon emissions. And so that's one of the things that gets me really excited about what we're doing, is because I think this model and what we're doing makes the most sense when we're looking at what does it look like to successfully deploy nuclear energy in a way that's valuable and helpful to communities that are sort of battling that tension point of energy poverty and also addressing climate change.
Thank you, Jackie. And I can tell you're very energized about this. It's great. So we have time for a couple more questions. One is from Jeff Merrifield. He states, Jackie, aren't there a variety of suppliers, Centrus, Orano, Urenco, GLE, Silex, that could provide this material, and that the actions in Ukraine may have provided the market signals to invest in HALO production?
I hope so, Jeff. Yes. So yes, of course, to the first part of that question, which is there are absolutely a variety of suppliers here in the U.S. that could jump in and do this decade, if not, and Centrus, if not sooner. I mean, they really have been sort of on the cutting edge of preparing for being able to deploy a facility that's capable of this, and on the licensing front too. And so, you know, I'm hopeful that this is just another sort of piece to the pie in getting that side of our industry as sort of on the same page as us, right? I think there's just always been this lag where you've had developers out front, you know, working and designing the reactors and working towards deployment, and this fuel, as I referred to it earlier, this long tent pole. You know, I think that this moment that we find ourselves in, not only on the sort of enriching side with companies like Centrus and Urenco, but also on what we're doing with the recycling side, it's interesting to kind of see what I think is, I don't know, sort of like an interesting time with all these different events converging. You know, we've got support in Congress. It's bipartisan support. I think it's just about timing now. It's about actually really getting the ball rolling with the work that the Department of Energy is doing, getting the ball rolling with the companies, and really seeing sort of increased confirmed interest from companies like Urenco, and ultimately, you know, hopefully finding ourselves in a position here in the next, 5 to 10 years where we've had enough support and interest to have a Centrus and UNCO offering competitive pricing in a market with more than one company.
Okay, you have an interested customer. What's the best way for an interested customer to sign up for this service? Jacob?
Yeah, I mean, best way to reach us is either through makestuff@oklo.com or send us a note at media@oklo.com. We'll channel it that way.
And let's see, I think we have maybe one more question for Commissioner Paratek that states, how do you think about the role of traditional nuclear generators and how to approach the traditional safety considerations with that of a compact microreactor? And how does that scale with the advanced technologies?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. I mean, this is one of the interesting challenges that we've tried to get involved with since very early in our history. That's why we were the first of the advanced reactor developers sort of to engage with the NRC in formal pre-application and work through some of these different issues. I think we've made a lot of progress so far. I mean, I can tell you, when we started engaging in 2016, there's a lot of things that were foreign here. And the idea of submitting a completely different looking license application from what had been submitted before was definitely not on anyone's radar of possibility. A few years later, we piloted one. We got feedback that was quite doable and something the NRC was actually eager to see, in the sense of like aligning for, I would say, a risk informed and sort of screened review to be focused on the right things that matter. And then we submitted an application on it. And there's so many things here that are different. It's actually, I mean, we could have a couple more webinars just talking through those. And it's exciting to see how much progress we made. There's still some to do, obviously, but we actually find ourselves pretty close on a lot of this, and we're not that far from getting these things done. The news on the denial was pretty disappointing and all that, but at the same time, I look at it as an iteration. And when you're trying to do these new things, you got to try this stuff. You learn from the experiences. We got a lot of the way there. We didn't get all the way there. Now we can go back and finish it off. But what we see is that there's a lot of experiences there that have already gone forward and informed current activities the NRC is doing in terms of updating and preparing to receive advanced reactor licenses, and that the international community is following as well. And like Jackie said, a really exciting thing too is there's a lot of countries that recognize the importance of what these kinds of technologies afford, especially when you think about a plant that can run for 10 to 20 years without needing fuel. That provides a lot of energy security and a lot of energy independence, and they don't want to wait, right? And so they're trying to move forward aggressively. There's a lot of great resources at the IAEA and at the international level for them to do it. Obviously, they're not going to all try to harmonize. I mean, harmonization is a great goal to keep working towards, but it takes a long time. So they're going to move forward with, sort of regardless of that, and implement best regulatory practices to bring these things forward. But the world wants this, right? And I think it's a pretty exciting time to see how this is going. But I think it's really important, though, that we, this is an opportunity for the United States to lead. Another comment I'll just make geopolitically, right? We talked about Russia and fuel supplies. Russia also is the leading exporter, broadly speaking, internationally for nuclear power plants and technologies. They had an order book of, hundreds of billions of dollars for new builds of nuclear power plants around the world. And we see a lot of those countries looking at different options now, and especially interested in different options. And I think this is a really important opportunity for the U.S. to sort of step up and lead here. We should be the leader. And now we have a clear opportunity to make sure we cement that. We need to do that.
Well, Jacob, Jackie, this has been very fascinating. And there are many questions that we were not able to address on this call. So maybe we can have you back and answer the rest of those questions. And I'll turn it back. And I thank you so much for coming today. Commissioner O'Donnell.
Thank you, Commissioner Duffley. Thank you to Jacob and Jackie for their time, and the DOE Office of Nuclear Energy for supporting this webinar. Our next quarterly meeting will be on April 7th from 2 to 3 p.m. A calendar invitation will be emailed to members after this webinar. You can find today's presentation and recording on NARUC's website and emailed to attendees next week. Check NARUC's website for information on other upcoming events, and please reach out to Kira and Jasmine at NARUC with any questions or feedback. And again, thank you to our panelists. Good job. And that will conclude today's webinar.